the current country of Matsuika. Before this country existed, there was a major war involving most of the countries of the world. The UN tried to keep the peace, but each country, most led by self-serving leaders at the time, were plunged into war. This war lasted hundreds of years and ultimately weakened every country, but most remained standing. Countries broke former alliances and created new ones to suit their needs. Surprisingly, one of the alliances that was formed was between Japan and China. Out of necessity to survive, they broke their old tensions and helped each other. Soon after the war ended, other countries were too weak to export goods and instead used their own resources to rebuild. China wanted to stop paying for expensive imported materials and wanted to be able to use what they had to manufacture things on their own, so they decided to take over a country with a lot of natural resources. The cost of war would be great in the short run, but would provide them with extremely cheaper materials in the long run, which would make them nearly self-sufficient. China decided that Canada, although being far away, had the most abundant and most ready resources. However, taking over a country so close to another country in the UN would be a problem. Unless than Japan for their technology, the two countries started a war with Canada. With the state of the politically unstable world in mind, China figured that the UN would oppose its quest to conquer Canada for its resources. With this in mind, China and Japan realized that it would be a huge blow to the UN to lose America. The UN could possibly completely fall apart without America, just as the League of Nations did. So, they went to war with America too, and because America was weak and unsuspecting, China and Japan won. The colonies were called the Chinlo no Mirai, or the Chinlo for short. Because Japanese and Chinese share a script, they found it easy to learn the other's language. The Chinese people learned Japanese, Tokyo dialect, and the Japanese people learned Mandarin. When the countries took over Canada, those who did not resist were allowed education for their children. Over time, the language turned into a mix of Japanese and Chinese. The mix was simply Chinese with Japanese hiragana particles called kosakugo. The Chinese, Japanese, and Canadian people were upset. China couldn't afford to make the conditions better for their soldiers, which sparked a small hatred between China and their soldiers. The Japanese soldiers, who worked under better conditions than the Chinese, were upset with China for not providing more for its own soldiers. Ryota Satoshi was, at first, a small speaker who called into question basic human rights. His popularity grew, and eventually he became a well-known leader of the rebellion against the dictatorship of American colonies and Canadian colonies. Not only did Canadians listen to what he said, the Chinese people sent to colonize America and Chinese soldiers listened too, as well as the Americans. His ideas created groups of people who wanted something more. These people banded together and created a rebellion that won back their rights from China and Japan. As Canada was being claimed by Japan and China, a very strict personalistic government was put in place in the claimed areas. The dictator was first elected by the people who were sent to colonize Canada, with a final judgment made by the Japanese military and Chinese military, and from then on ruled the colonies. This dictator was called the Saiko. The Saiko had small groups of people that he chose to help him rule. Because the dictatorship was passed down from family to family, those small groups changed from family member to family member. Those small groups changed over time based on the dictator's liking. The dictator governed everyone in the colonies to maintain unity, but had to obey the Japanese and Chinese governments if they ordered him. While each dictator had different roles, they all had the following in common: secret spies, a large military with its soldiers chosen by drafts, and strict rules on how the colonials were able to act in public. Japanese and Chinese colonials were allowed the freedom of speech should it not contradict the government. However, the Canadians and Americans did not enjoy this privilege. When the rebellion struck, the dictatorship was a huge obstacle that took time to bring down. Luckily, the rebels were able to form their own militias and sneak their way closer to the dictator. The last dictator was imprisoned because of a small coup d'etat led by respected rebellion leaders. These leaders went on to lead the Council of 12, with only Ryota Satoshi and Zhao Guo declining to join. They decided that these 12 people would control their own sectors of government, and each with their own group of advisors. Below those advisors was a huge group of 2,000 people who represented the citizens. If the 12 needed input from the people they were governing, this group would respond with what the citizens said. Once this council was stable, they expanded by creating smaller capital-like places which held other minor councils. They spread out across the region and could govern their own region, but they had to obey the 12. If something happened to one of the 12, the citizens would elect another person. If something happened to all of the 12, the councils would elect their strongest member to lead. The capital of Matsuika was established in Vancouver because of the airport's boats and roads leading in and out of it. The city and all the small capitals were strengthened and adorned with huge buildings reminiscent of Chinese and Japanese architecture. Both China and Japan brought over their yuan and yen to Canada. After the war, the value of the currencies deflated because the cost of the products decreased, as a result of a surplus of supply after the war. Yen was worth about a tenth of a won, so over time yen became the currency of Matsuika because of its worth. The Canadians and Americans who did not resist were allowed to have unwanted jobs, but they were still respected by others. As the colonies separated, they grew to have more and more rights, while the Canadians who resisted during the invasion were killed or had other uses. After some time, if someone didn't resist and prove their allegiance to the Chinlo and had formal education, they could have better jobs. Now, the empire creates innovative technology, manufactures, and exports raw materials. After China, traditions from China and Japan were brought into Matsuika. This includes fashion, politeness, respect to black cats, awe of dragons, and the Spring Festival. Politeness was brought over from Japan, so the women were well respected in Matsuika and had as many rights as men did. The combination of all these cultures is Matsuika's legacy. After China and Japan invaded Canada and America, all four countries were left extremely weak. There is tension between China and Japan, but if China started a war with Japan, the other countries that were a part of an alliance with Canada might have fought against China out of revenge, so China could not go to war with Japan. As China and Japan were waging war, they claimed Canada geographically from left to right. Therefore, most of the developed cities in Canada and America were on the left side of the country. It was a few hundred years before the people rebelled due to poor conditions, so the people were almost fully redeveloped before they claimed their independence. For the most part, women were respected and had as many rights as men do. Like in Canada, the woman had rights, but Matsuika is a step backwards. The people are working on allowing women rights again, but they are currently a bit looked down upon.